Rain hammered the tin roofs like distant gunfire. Searchlights swept across the camp, white beams slicing through the downpour, landing on a line of soaked women in tattered uniforms. It was 1945, somewhere in the Philippines. The war was technically over, but inside this U.S. POW compound, it felt like the world still hadn't decided who deserved mercy. The women stood barefoot, mud pooling around their ankles, shivering not from cold, but from what came next. A sergeant, chewing something bitter, barked 3 words that froze the air: "You'll eat the dirt." The guards waited. Nobody moved. The rain fell harder, drumming on helmets. The women stared ahead, their faces lit like statues caught in lightning. Then, one of them, a small woman with black hair plastered to her cheeks, slowly knelt. Her name was Michiko. She pressed her trembling fingers into the mud and lowered her head, lips touching the wet ground. Around her, a line of broken silence. The sergeant's jaw tightened. No laughter, just orders. The guards turned away, muttering about discipline and respect. The women didn't understand the words, but they understood power. Behind the fences, the war's statistics felt meaningless. Over 4,000 Japanese civilians, wives, nurses, clerks had been captured across the Philippines in those last chaotic weeks. Many had believed surrender was worse than death. Now, standing in a foreign rain, they realized surrender had its own vocabulary of humiliation. Later, a guard offered them rice, cold, sticky, metallic, tasting from the tin bowls. The same hands that had forced them into the mud now handed them food. Michiko ate in silence, the taste of soil still clinging to her tongue. That night, a whispered line passed through the barracks: "We were soldiers' widows, treated as animals." But in that whisper, something else flickered. A strange defiance. They had survived the Empire's collapse, the bombings, the surrender. This camp was not the end. As the rain slowed, Michiko looked up through the wire fence toward a flickering American lantern. The war might have ended on paper, but for her it was only beginning. She would remember that phrase, "You'll eat the dirt," for the rest of her life. And soon she'd remember the moment before it too, the moment of her capture. Next came the memory that haunted her most. The day everything ended. Dust, not rain, filled the sky that day. August 1945. The sun above Manila was a white furnace, and the road outside a ruined schoolyard shimmered with heat. Michiko clutched a strip of white cloth torn from her kimono, a makeshift flag of surrender. Around her, Japanese civilians shuffled forward under American rifles. The silence was so thick that even the flies seemed to hover without sound. For days they'd hidden in sugarcane fields, living on rainwater and whatever roots they could dig up. Word spread like ghost stories. The emperor had spoken. Some refused to believe it. Others burned their documents, swallowed their medals, and wept. Michiko's husband had been among those sent to fight near Baton. His last letter said only, "Die before shame." She couldn't. When the first American patrol arrived, jeeps coated in dust, soldiers wary but calm, the women froze. No gunfire, just orders, gestures, and a strange rhythm of control. They were told to step forward, drop any weapons, and sit. One young American gave them water, cold, metallic, from a canteen that smelled faintly of chlorine. She drank, half expecting a bullet to follow. Reports from that month estimate over 60,000 Japanese troops and civilians surrendered across the Philippines alone. Each one a collapse of a decade's worth of propaganda. In Tokyo's schools they'd learned, Americans are monsters. But here, in the blazing sunlight, those monsters handed out ration biscuits. The cognitive dissonance cracked something deep inside. "I thought they would torture us," Michiko later wrote. Instead, they just looked tired. The soldiers herded them toward the camp trucks. No shouting, just efficiency. Engines growled, diesel fumes thick in the air. The women climbed into the backs, pressing close to one another for balance. Michiko's hands trembled as the truck rolled forward. The horizon shimmered fields, smoke, distant ruins. The convoy passed a burn, doubt village, charred signs, a child's toy hearth. buried in ash. The war had ended, but the smell of it was still alive. When they reached the camp gates, Michiko saw a row of helmets glinting under the floodlights, the same helmets she would see again in that rain-soaked night. The same voices that would soon say those words, and as the gate clanged shut behind her, she didn't yet know that survival meant obeying the unthinkable. By the third night in camp, the rain had turned the ground into a swamp of footprints and rot. Canvas tents sagged, the smell of kerosene hanging in the humid air. Michiko sat with her knees pulled close, staring at the line of wooden barrels where food was stored. Hunger had stripped away pride faster than any command ever could. When the guards appeared, everything went still. Boots squelched through the mud. A U.S. sergeant pointed to the barrels and barked, "Crawl if you want it." His tone wasn't cruel, just empty. Like someone repeating an order he didn't believe in anymore. The women hesitated. Then, one by one, they fell forward onto their hands and knees. The sound, mud-sucking, bones creaking, echoed across the camp. No one knew if it was punishment or a twisted mercy. For the Americans, it was control. For the prisoners, it was submission with calories attached. Each scoop of rice tasted of rust, of dirt, of something lost. On paper, the numbers told a different story. U.S. POW rations averaged 300 calories per day, while Japanese soldiers during the final months of the war had survived on barely 800. The difference wasn't just in food, it was in power. A full stomach could be an empire in itself. Michiko chewed slowly, feeling her own shame dissolve into numb acceptance. Around her, others ate greedily, coughing, crying, whispering thanks to no one. The sergeant walked past, eyes unreadable. Maybe he pitied them, maybe he hated them, no one would ever know. A young American corporal leaned against the fence, watching. Later, he wrote in his diary, they looked more human crawling than defiant. It wasn't mockery, it was confusion. The myth of the unbreakable enemy had melted into something fragile and wet and trembling. Michiko swallowed the last grain, lifted her face, and met his stare. For a heartbeat neither moved, then she looked away, shame burning like fever. We were fed. She would recall, but first we had to crawl for it. That night, she lay awake listening to the rain drum on canvas, wondering what was worse, dying for honor or living like this. And in the pale morning light, when a guard handed her a bar of soap, she didn't know whether to be grateful or afraid. The next morning smelled different, sharp, clean, almost alien. The guards had set out basins of water, metal tins of soap, and rough towels stamped with U.S. Army. The air carried the scent of lye and something floral. To the women, it was both promise and warning. "Wash," one of the guards said, motioning with a cigarette in his mouth. No translation, just gestures. The women looked at one another, hesitant. Back home, cleanliness was ritual, not command. Here, it felt like another test. The first woman stepped forward, dipped her hands, and gasped at the shock of cold water. The sound was almost holy. A hiss, a breath, a release. Soap foamed between her fingers. She rubbed her arms, the dirt coming off in grey streaks. For a moment, she saw her skin again human, not prisoner. Others followed. Soon, the line of basins filled with women scrubbing in silence. A corporal watched, scribbling in a notebook. He wasn't mocking them. He was recording. The army had orders to keep camps disease-free. Statistics mattered more than sentiment. In American run zones, lice infections dropped over 70% within weeks. Hygiene wasn't mercy, it was logistics. Michiko scrubbed harder, the bar slipping from her hand. When she picked it up, the scent hit her, lavender. It transported her back years to the day she'd washed her husband's uniform before he left for the front. Same smell, same careful folding, same illusion of order. The memory hurt more than hunger. She looked up and caught a glimpse of her reflection in the water, basin, hair clumped, eyes hollow, but alive. Cleanliness felt more like control than kindness. She would later write. But maybe control was the only kindness left. That afternoon, the women's barracks smelled faintly of soap instead of sweat. Some guards commented how they looked civilized now, unaware of the sting those words carried. Civilization was relative, survival wasn't. As night fell, Michiko lay awake, her skin tingling from the scrubbing. For the first time since capture, she didn't feel filthy. But that didn't mean she felt free. She rolled onto her side, listening to distant laughter from the American canteen. It sounded normal, too normal, and when the next morning's mail truck arrived bringing a bundle of letters tied with red twine, the camp's silence broke into something new hope mixed with fear. The mail truck rattled through the gates just after dawn, engine coughing, tires sinking into the damp soil. Every prisoner in the camp turned toward the sound. Letters meant connection, and connection meant danger. For months they had been ghosts. Now the world outside was trying to speak to them again. A Red Cross officer climbed down, holding a burlap sack full of envelopes stamped with red seals and censor marks. The guards stood watch as the names were read one by one slowly, carefully, like each syllable might shatter someone. Most letters were written months ago, before surrender. Some carried news of births, deaths, or the simple ache of waiting. Michiko Takahara, the interpreter, called. She froze, hardly believing her own name. The paper felt soft, almost warm, as she unfolded it. The handwriting was her sister's, crooked, hurried. "Mother is alive, the city is gone, we pray you are not." Her throat closed. The words blurred as tears hit the page. Around her, others sobbed openly, unashamed. A woman kissed her letter and held it to her chest. Another fainted, overcome. In that moment, the fences disappeared, replaced by the sound of human voices trying to reach across an ocean. The Red Cross estimated over 15 0 letters delivered to Japanese POW worldwide by 1946. To the prisoners, they weren't letters. They were proof they still existed. I cried because the paper smelled of home. One diary later read, "The envelopes carried the faint musk of tatami mats and wood smoke, scents that had survived the war better than people had." Michiko folded the letter carefully, hiding it inside her sleeve. She didn't want the guards to see her crying. Not because she feared them, but because she feared forgetting herself. That night, under dim bulbs, a nurse helped another woman write back. An illiterate midwife from Osaka. The nurse's English was slow, gentle. "Tell them you are alive," she said softly. The woman nodded, her hand shaking as she copied the shapes of each letter. Watching from her cot, Michiko felt something shift inside her. The same Americans who made them crawl for food were now delivering pieces of their lives back. The contradiction gnawed at her, but so did gratitude. The nurse's voice carried across the barracks, "We write for those who can't." And soon that voice would belong to her too. The first time Michiko saw her closely, the nurse looked more like a ghost than an enemy, face pale from tropical heat, uniform damp with sweat, a stethoscope glinting at her neck. She walked between cots with quiet precision, her canvas bag clinking with bottles. No words, no smiles. Just duty. Michiko's ankle had swollen from an old cut, red and throbbing. When the nurse knelt beside her, she flinched. The smell of antiseptic was sharp, almost violent. "Stay still," the nurse said softly, her accent clipped but calm. She cleaned the wound with steady hands, dabbing until the dirt bled away. The pain hit hard. Michiko bit her lip, refusing to cry. But beneath the sting there was something unfamiliar, gentleness. Not pity, not cruelty. Just human focus. Reports show over 500 American female medics served in Pacific POW sectors after 1945. Many treated both Allied and Axis prisoners, often under brutal conditions, heat, disease, shortages. They were trained to heal, not to hate. Michiko watched her work, memorizing every movement. The nurse said her name once, Claire. It sounded strange, like wind through broken glass. Claire checked her pulse, wrapped the ankle with clean gauze, and before leaving, slipped something small into Michiko's hand, a biscuit. Warm, crumbly, real, no one saw it happen. Michiko hid it under her blanket, holding it like treasure. For a moment, she wasn't a captive, she was a woman being cared for. Later, when the guards shouted orders outside, Claire glanced toward the tent flap but didn't flinch. Her eyes met Michiko's for a heartbeat, professional, unreadable, but not cold. Her hands were steady, not cruel. Michiko would later write in her journal, "I didn't understand that kind of strength. That night, she shared the biscuit with another woman. They broke it into crumbs, each taking a piece as if performing a sacred act. The sweetness was faint, but enough to remind them that life could still surprise." Outside, the camp generators hummed, insects droned, and distant thunder rolled. Inside, two enemies sat shoulder to shoulder, chewing quietly, the sound of the storm softening around them. By dawn, a rumor spread through the barracks. The war trials had begun, and soon judgment would return not through bullets, but through courtroom silence. The mornings grew quieter after that, too quiet. The guards' tempers softened, but their eyes stayed sharp. Even the nurse, Claire, seemed distracted now, reading folded bulletins by lantern light, before tucking them quickly into her coat. Something was changing outside the wire. The rumors began as whispers at night. Tokyo trials. Someone murmured. War crimes, executions. The words hung in the humid air like smoke no one wanted to inhale. None of them knew what it meant for people like them, wives, clerks, nurses who'd served an empire now on trial. One guard finally confirmed it. Tribunals had begun. Across Asia, hundreds of Japanese officers were being judged for atrocities: Baton, Nanking, Manila. Over 700 Japanese tried, 984 executed by the end of it. The numbers passed through the barracks like a fever. "They're judging our men while we rot here," one woman muttered bitterly. Michiko said nothing. She stared at her hands, clean now, bandaged, almost foreign. Her husband's last words echoed, "Die before shame." Would he have been among the condemned, or was he already buried in the ash of some nameless hillside? The contradictions grew louder. The same Americans who handed out letters and bandages were now hangmen in distant cities. The prisoners listened to the guards' radio when they could. Snatches of English filtered through static words like justice, responsibility, peace. They all sounded the same, victory in another language. That night, Claire stopped by her cot again, checking her bandage. Michiko couldn't help asking, voice low, "Do they all deserve to die?" Claire froze, then answered carefully, "Some things need answers, not revenge." It was the first honest sentence Michiko had heard since her capture. Outside, the tropical wind rattled the fence. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. The world beyond the camp seemed to be rebuilding itself, while theirs stayed frozen in mud. The next morning, the guards carried new rifles. The tension was back. A sergeant whispered about guerrillas nearby holdouts refusing surrender. War wasn't over, it was just changing shape. Michiko folded her blanket tighter. If justice was a word for men with power, then what did survival mean for women without it? That question lingered long after dark, until the gunfire started in the hills. The gunfire came like thunder, short bursts, then silence, then another crack that echoed through the jungle. The camp lights snapped on, flooding everything in harsh white. Guards shouted, boots pounded the gravel, and the air filled with the smell of diesel and fear. Michiko jolted upright on her cot, heart racing. Around her, women clutched blankets, eyes wide, too afraid to speak. No one knew if the shooting was outside or coming for them. The barracks shook as soldiers ran past the door, rifles ready. "Stay inside." Someone yelled in English. The words were sharp, meaningless to most, but the tone said everything. The rumors had been true. Japanese holdouts still roamed the hills. Over 27 attacks on Allied camps reported between 1945 and 1947. Men who refused to surrender, surviving off stolen rice and jungle roots, still fighting for an empire that no longer existed. Inside the camp, that defiance translated into terror. Some prisoners whispered, "They're coming to save us." Others whispered, "They'll kill us all to erase our shame." A stray bullet ripped through the barracks roof. The women ducked, pressing faces into the dirt floor. Michiko felt the vibration of the shot travel through her chest. She tasted blood from biting her tongue. The lights flickered. Outside, a guard shouted, "Hold the perimeter." Someone screamed back, "Contact north fence." Then, silence again. The jungle swallowed the noise. Minutes passed like hours. Michiko could hear her own breathing. She remembered her husband's face, blurred by memory and propaganda posters, his voice echoing, "Death before capture." For the first time, she wasn't sure if he'd been brave or just wrong. When the all-clear finally came, the camp exhaled. Guards slumped against posts, exhausted. No bodies this time, just shadows that had vanished into trees. One soldier lit a cigarette, the flame trembling in his hand. The smoke curled upward, thin and fragile against the dark. Michiko watched him from the barracks doorway, rain starting again. The firelight flickered over his face. Young, scared human. She realized both sides were trapped in wars that refused to end. The jungle quieted, but the unease stayed. And when dawn crept over the horizon, the smell of smoke lingered, replaced slowly by something new. Cooking rice. Morning came with the smell of rice, real rice steaming, sticky, sweet in the air. For the first time in weeks, it wasn't rationed in silence. The guards were talking, laughing even, their voices drifting through the fence. Someone said the Filipino cooks were joining them today. A strange invitation followed. The POW women could eat too. With them, at first, no one moved. It sounded like a trap or a test. But when the gate opened, the scent of garlic and soy drew them like gravity. They walked cautiously toward the mess tent barefoot, tense, expecting humiliation. Instead, they found tables, plates, steam, and men not yelling. A mess sergeant, sleeves rolled up, motioned for them to sit. "Food's food," he muttered, "war's done." It was a sentence heavy with exhaustion, not mercy. That morning, for the first time, they ate among Americans and Filipino workers. Pots clattered, laughter echoed, a radio played faint swing music, alien yet soothing. Michiko held a spoon awkwardly, trying to remember how to eat like a human again. U.S. supply reports later showed the staggering scale behind such moments. Over 5 million meals served daily across Pacific bases in 1946. Logistics as empathy, feeding as control, but to the prisoners it felt like the first crack in the wall. Michiko stared at the men across the table faces. That once symbolized horror now just looked tired, homesick. One offered her salt. She nodded, whispering arigato. He didn't understand but smiled anyway. We ate rice again. She would write years later, but this time with laughter nearby. For a brief hour, the war evaporated. Even the guards seemed unsure what lines still existed. Humanity returned awkwardly between bites of shared food. When the meal ended, the women were told to return to their barracks. No shouting, no guns. Just quiet footsteps over gravel. Michiko looked back once and saw the sergeant wiping his hands, looking straight at her. Not like an enemy, but like a man trying to understand what forgiveness looked like. The next day, a new noise arrived in camp, the whir of a camera shutter. A journalist had come to take pictures. And with that click, the fragile piece would be captured, frozen, and misread by the world. The camera arrived like a weapon, quiet, shiny, unblinking. The man carrying it wore khaki, not a rifle. His uniform said press. His smile said nothing. He walked through the camp gates, trailed by 2 soldiers and an interpreter, scanning the women as though searching for a story worth freezing forever. Michiko was hanging laundry when he stopped near her. The lens lifted, clicked once. The sound was small but final, like a door locking. She flinched. He didn't ask permission. None of them did. Later, they gathered the women near the mess tent, arranged them in rows under the flagpole. "Look up," the interpreter said. "Smile if you can." No one moved. Some turned away. The photographer adjusted the focus, sweat beading on his forehead. A guard muttered, "Life magazine wants proof they're doing fine." Proof. That word stung more than hunger ever had. In the months that followed, over 2,000 such photos were taken across Allied camps. Most were censored. Too sympathetic, too human. Officials feared they'd make Americans pity their former enemies. Still, a few slipped through, published in Sunday spreads with headlines like "Surrendered Souls," "The Women of Japan." Michiko saw her own face weeks later, thin, solemn, caught between dignity and defeat. A Filipino interpreter showed her the magazine, laughing softly. "You're famous now." She stared at the image. The background blurred, but her eyes were clear, defiant. They wanted proof we were tamed. She would later write, "But that photo made me remember I wasn't." Some guards teased them after the shoot, saying the world would think they were treated like queens. Others shrugged. Just another day of orders and optics. But something inside the camp shifted after that. The women stood straighter. Their silence grew heavier, sharper. They had been made visible again, and that visibility came with danger and power. That night, Claire, the nurse, passed Michiko by the water barrel. "I saw your picture," she said softly. "You looked strong." For once, Michiko believed it, but strength had a cost, because visibility invited judgment, and soon the stories in those photographs would reach home. And home, as they were about to learn, wasn't the same place anymore. That night, the camp was unusually quiet. The guards had retreated to their posts, the rain had stopped, and the jungle buzzed like static. Inside the barracks, someone lit a candle stub and placed it in a tin cup. Its trembling light drew faces from the dark, hollow eyes, stitched sleeves, and exhaustion that no rest could cure. It began with a whisper. "I lied to my son," one woman said, her voice cracked. "I told him his father died a hero." Another murmured, "Mine died from hunger before the Americans even came." The words tumbled out, one after another, years of silence collapsing under candlelight. They weren't confessions to God or to their captors. They were to themselves. Michiko listened, frozen. She had spent years believing the same things: honor, obedience, glory. Yet in this damp wooden room, those ideas fell apart like ash in rain. "I served tea to officers," another woman said. "They told us Japan could never fall. We believed them." Someone else replied softly, "We weren't betrayed by enemies, but by faith." Outside, a guard's radio hummed faint jazz. Inside, a different kind of rhythm rose, truth spoken without fear. By 1946, Japan's suicide rate had spiked nearly 30% among returning families. The war hadn't ended for them, it had only changed shape. The same propaganda that told them surrender was shame now left them to live with survival. Michiko finally spoke. Her hands shook as she said, "My husband wanted me to die for him. I couldn't. I don't know if that makes me coward or alive." No one answered. They didn't need to. The candle burned lower, melting wax across the table like spilled memories. For the first time, she didn't feel alone in her doubt. Around her, former patriots were becoming something else, something freer, though they didn't yet have a word for it. Claire, the nurse, passed by outside, pausing to glance through the open slat. She saw the women sitting together, their shadows fused, their posture different. Less afraid, that night, Michiko made a promise in silence. She would not die for anyone's honor again. And when dawn came, carrying the sound of a distant ship's horn, she realized that promise was about to be tested. The horn blared at sunrise, low, metallic, final. Word spread through the camp before the interpreters even arrived. Names were being read. Repatriation, home, whatever that meant now, the women lined up under the same flagpole where they'd once been photographed. The air was thick with anticipation, and something darker fear of what waited beyond the wire. A clipboard officer called out names in broken Japanese. Each one answered like a ghost coming back to life. Michiko Takahara. Her heart stopped for a beat. Then she stepped forward, no tears, no smile, just quiet disbelief. By April 1946, the Allied forces were processing thousands of returns. That month alone, 160 Japanese civilians were repatriated from camps across the Philippines. They would board U.S. naval transports, sail through mined waters, and step onto soil they no longer recognized. A Red Cross nurse handed each woman a small paper tag, name, number, destination. No luggage, no keepsakes. Everything left behind. Even the biscuit tin she'd kept hidden was confiscated at inspection. Regulations, the sergeant said, not unkindly. Claire found her near the gate. You're leaving, she said quietly. Home's waiting. Michiko nodded, unable to answer. How could she explain that home felt like another kind of sentence? The women were herded onto trucks, engines sputtering. The camp shrank behind them, barbed wire gleaming in the sun. No one spoke. Some stared back, others refused. Michiko looked until the guard towers disappeared, until all she saw were palm trees bending in the wind. At the port, the sight of the transport ship made her dizzy. Steel hull, American flag, gangplank slick with rain. She climbed slowly, clutching the railing. The air smelled of salt and diesel. For a moment she thought she heard her husband's voice again, soft, commanding, telling her not to come back. But she was coming back anyway, changed, scarred, still breathing. As the ship pulled away, the coastline blurred into mist. Behind her, the island that had been her prison vanished under the horizon. Ahead, Japan waited, burned, broken, and silent. The women stood on deck in borrowed coats, watching the waves fold over themselves. One whispered, "We survived." And Michiko, staring east, thought, "Now we'll see what survival costs." Tokyo smelled of dust and burnt paper. The port workers barely looked up as the repatriation ship docked. Just another load of ghosts returning from the Lost War. When Michiko stepped onto Japanese soil, the ground felt lighter than she remembered, as if everything sacred had already crumbled away. The city stretched before her in ruins, streets carved into ash, walls standing without roofs, a silence so wide it drowned even the sound of the gulls. In some districts, weeds grew taller than the rubble. It wasn't a city anymore. It was a graveyard breathing smoke. She walked for hours, guided by memory, not maps. The tram lines were twisted metal. The wooden houses she'd known were gone. Somewhere near what had once been Ueno, she found a small crowd lined up for rice rations. Thin, silent, waiting like statues. 40% of Tokyo had been destroyed during the American bombing campaigns, according to Allied reconstruction records. The statistics didn't convey the texture of it. The burned tatami, the melted glass, the smell of wet cinders after rain. A relief worker handed her a card for temporary housing. "Former POW?" he asked softly. She nodded. His eyes flickered with something between pity and discomfort. No one wanted to know the stories of those who'd survived the unendurable. That night, in a shelter near the Sumida River, Michiko unwrapped the only thing she still carried, her Red Cross name tag stained with sea salt. Around her, children slept on straw mats, mothers whispering lullabies that sounded more like prayers. The next morning, she went to find her husband's grave. It wasn't a grave, really. Just a charred wooden marker stuck in the dirt beside a temple wall. His name had been half burned away. No body, no ashes, no closure. Just words fading like everything else. She knelt, tracing the missing letters with her fingers. For the first time, she didn't cry. The war had already taken all her tears. She whispered, "You told me to die before shame. I lived instead." The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of rebuilding. Fresh timber, coal smoke, the hammering of men raising walls again. Life, somehow, was beginning to stir among the ruins. And soon, someone would come looking for voices like hers, voices that had seen both sides of surrender. The summons came quietly, no threats, no fanfare, just a folded note handed to Michiko at the ration line. "Report to U.S. Liaison Office, Building 12, Chiyoda." She stared at the letters for a long time. The paper smelled faintly of ink and authority. The building was one of the few left-standing windows, patched, flag hanging limp. Inside, desks were lined with typewriters clacking like gunfire. The Allied occupation had turned paperwork into its own kind of war. A young interpreter met her at the door. "They want to hear your story," he said, "about the camp." She hesitated. Her story wasn't one thing. It was hunger, dirt, humiliation, small kindnesses. But stories were currency now. Whoever controlled them controlled what history remembered. In a narrow office, 2 American officers sat behind a table stacked with files. A third, a civilian in glasses, clicked his pen and smiled politely. "Mrs. Takahara, thank you for coming. We're collecting civilian testimonies for the record." The words "for the record" landed heavy. She began to speak slowly, describing the nights of rain, the crawling for food, the nurse's biscuit, the photo. One officer typed everything, fingers moving without pause. By 1947, over 3,000 Japanese civilians had been interviewed by Allied commissions, each testimony a fragment of a nation's reckoning. Most were never published, too complicated, too grey for the story of good versus evil the world preferred. They wrote every word like it was evidence. She would recall later, not of guilt or innocence, but of existence. At one point she stopped mid-sentence. The officer looked up. "You were saying he told you to eat the dirt." Michiko nodded. "Yes," her voice barely a whisper. "And I did." The man scribbled something, then asked why. She looked him straight in the eye. "Because I wanted to live." Silence filled the room, thicker than smoke. No one wrote after that. The interview ended without ceremony. One of them stood, offering her a cup of water. She didn't take it. As she stepped back into the streets of Tokyo, she could hear the clatter of reconstruction nails, wood, trains, life resuming. But her mind was still inside that office, reliving the phrase that had started it all. And now, finally, she was ready to understand it. The afternoon light fell through broken glass, scattering patterns across the street. Tokyo was alive again, vendors shouting, trams groaning, children darting between piles of rubble that now looked almost ordinary. Michiko walked slowly, the Red Cross tag still folded in her pocket. For months she had avoided looking back. But today she let herself remember. She remembered the mud, the rain, the American sergeant's voice. "You'll eat the dirt." Back then, she thought it meant humiliation, defeat, the end of everything she was. But now in this rebuilt city, she realized it had meant something else too. Survival at any cost. Reports from 1952 show Japan receiving over $2 billion in U.S. reconstruction aid, rebuilding its cities faster than any nation in post-war Asia. But that recovery wasn't just cement and steel. It was millions of people learning to live again after losing everything that defined them. Michiko stepped past a street vendor selling rice cakes. The smell was warm, familiar, grounding. A young boy handed her a napkin when she dropped one. She thanked him in English without thinking. The language that once chained her now slipped easily from her tongue. She sat on a low wall overlooking the river, watching sunlight ripple where bombed bridges had once been. For the first time, she didn't feel the weight of being a victim or a survivor, just a person, ordinary, breathing. She unfolded her sister's letter from years ago, edges yellowed, words fading. "Mother is alive, the city is gone. We pray you are not." She smiled faintly. Both had been true once, but now both were changing. Dignity isn't given. She whispered, "It's rebuilt." Somewhere behind her, hammers clanged and trains roared. The sound of a nation mending itself. She thought of Claire the nurse with steady hands, and wondered if she was alive somewhere in another rebuilt city, patching different wounds. Michiko stood, brushing dust from her skirt. The wind carried the faint scent of lavender soap, the same one from the camp. It almost made her laugh. The war had taken everything, but somehow it had left behind the smell of being clean again. She turned toward the crowd, merging with it, her face disappearing into motion and light, not a prisoner. Not a symbol, just alive, and as the city's sirens wailed for the noon hour, Tokyo finally exhaled.